welcome to the third James A. Thurber Dialogue in Democracy, a series of conversations we've been having this semester with prominent thought leaders about the growing threats to democracy and what we can do about them. I'm David Barker, the director of the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies here at American University, and I'll be your host tonight. Our mission here at the center is to strengthen the democratic square through research, public events, and hands-on training programs. And we are proud to co-sponsor this event with AU's Government Department and the Kennedy Political Union. These dialogues celebrate the career of our beloved colleague, distinguished university professor James A. Thurber. Jim is transitioning to emeritus status this summer after 47 illustrious years studying American democracy, contributing to it, and enlightening others about it. He's quick to point out, though, that he is not actually retiring. He's under contract for 2 books still, after all, among other things. For those of you who know Jim, I encourage you to stick around at the end of tonight's event for a little something extra to honor him. Our guests tonight, much to our delight, are Robert Putnam and Shaylyn Romney Garrett, authors of The Upswing, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. Dr. Putnam is the Malcolm Research Professor of Public Policy at Harvard University and a former dean of the John F. Kennedy School of Government. Nationally honored as a leading humanist and a renowned scientist, he has written 14 books, including the best-selling Our Kids and Bowling Alone, and he's consulted for the last 4 US presidents. In 2012, President Obama awarded him the National Humanities Medal, the nation's highest honor for contributions to the humanities. His research program, the Saguaro Seminar, is dedicated to fostering civic engagement in America. Shaylyn Romney Garrett is a writer and award-winning social entrepreneur. She is a founding contributor to Weave, the Social Fabric Project, an Aspen Institute initiative. She also contributed to Robert Putnam and David Campbell's book, American Grace. Shaylyn holds a degree in government from Harvard University and is a returned Peace Corps volunteer. At any point during the conversation tonight, feel free to pose a question in the Q&A. We will reserve around 15 minutes at the end to get through as many of those as we can. Please remember to keep your questions civil, to skip the ideological grandstanding, and to honor Alex Trebek by posing your question as an actual question. All right, with that, I'll go ahead and hand the virtual microphone over now to my colleague, Professor Candace Nelson. She will formally introduce Dr. Thurber. Take it away, Candy.
Thank you, David. It is my privilege to introduce my friend, my mentor, and my colleague, distinguished university professor James A. Thurber. As David said, these dialogues celebrate the illustrious career of Professor Thurber. During his career, Jim has done many things. He's been an award-winning instructor, a congressional staffer and longtime advisor to both Congress and the executive branch, a journal editor, a documentarian, an acting dean, the founder and director of the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies, a sponsor of more than 350 public events and conferences, a principal investigator on many research grants totaling millions of dollars, and an author or editor of over 50 books and monographs, over 40 peer-reviewed journal articles, and well over 100 book chapters and other publications. But the heart of Jim's 47 years at American University has been his support and encouragement of the students and faculty in the Department of Government, the School of Public Affairs, and his colleagues throughout the university. For that, we will always be grateful. I will now turn the program over to Professor Thurber.
Thank you, Professor Nelson. That was very, very kind of you. My mother would be very proud of that introduction, I'm sure. Bob and Shaylyn, welcome. The Upswing is directly relevant to our dialogues. This is the last of our dialogues on democracy because it really discusses the state of our democracy. The central question of Upswing is, can a nation created to maximize individual freedom successfully pursue a common good? Major issue right now in America. And you answer this question with lots of data. You gather and analyze an extraordinary amount of data to examine 4 areas: economic inequality, comity and compromise in politics, social connectedness and trust, and the tension between self-interest and social obligation. And you do this over 100 years, in most cases from 1880 to present. And you find a remarkable confluence of trends. And you wrote this book, Upswing, finished it. It went to the publisher in January 2020, before the COVID pandemic, before Black Lives Matter protests, before the 2020 election, and Trump's response to that election, the invasion of the Capitol, and most importantly, to some questions I have later, you wrote it before you could see the policies of the Biden administration, the $1.9 trillion COVID and economic aid package, the numerous executive orders and executive branch appointments, plus now the Build Back Better initiative that looks like it's going to come out this week or next. All of it is a stunning shift in policies and priorities. We will return to that. But Bob, let's get started by having you offer really a short description of the primary purpose of the book, a little bit about the data, and then describe the findings related to the phenomena of the I, we, I cycle. Can you help us out, Bob?
I can, Jim, but first of all, can I say what, and I'm speaking on behalf of Shaylyn, what an extraordinary honor it is for us to be able to participate in this series of events honoring you. You and I are rough contemporaries. I've known your work for as long as I've been in this game, and you're one of the giants of our field. So, gosh, the opportunity to be here in this setting is a real privilege.
Well, thank you. That's very nice of you to say that. Thanks.
I want to, as you said, say a little bit about the background of this book. I have long been interested in social change in America, as you know, going back 20 or 30 years in terms of the writings. But as I've gotten older, I've wanted to try to continue to do high quality social science, but also I want to change America. And this book is an attempt to do both. That is an attempt to be as faithful as I can to the canons of social science. I'll say just a little bit about that in a second, but also to try to help move America in what I think is the right direction, a more democratic America, which would also be a less polarized, a more equal, a more connected, a less self-centered America. And so in the course of this project, we gathered a lot of data on those 4 dimensions you described over 125 years. We looked at trends in economic inequality. And those trends turn out to be pretty clear with many different measures that I won't go into now. At the beginning of the 20th century, at the end of the 19th century, around 1890, America was very unequal. But then at the beginning of the 20th century, that was what was called at the time, or in historic terms, that's the Gilded Age, big gaps between rich and poor. But at the beginning of the 20th century, things begin to change a little bit, and America becomes steadily, over the first 2/3 of the 20th century, America becomes steadily more equal, reaching a peak in about, roughly speaking, the 1960s. And then that curve reverses, and it goes down symmetrically to the other side. So the curve of political equality is a big inverted U, from inequality at the beginning to more equality at the middle in the 60s, 70s, and then back down now to one of the most unequal periods in American history economically. We do the same kind of analysis for trends in political polarization. Again, it turns out that at the beginning of the 20th century, late 19th century, America was extremely polarized, one of the most polarized periods in American history, big gaps between Republicans and Democrats. That trend begins to change in the early years of the 20th century, what comes later to be called the progressive era, moves upward steadily, more and more bipartisanship, more and more collaboration, reaching a peak sort of in the middle 50s with Dwight Eisenhower, the least partisan American president, and then reverses. And now we're at actually an even more polarized period. Probably now we're in a, statistically speaking, in a period of political polarization that is matched in American history only by the period between 1860 and 1865. I don't need to say what that period was. We do a similar analysis of what I called social capital in some earlier work, that is connections among people, the degree to which people are connected to their families and their communities and their community institutions and so on, trust one another. And that curve looks identical. It starts off America being very socially isolated, without much connections among Americans, begins to rise in the early 20th century, reaches a peak in the middle 60s, turns south. And by now, we're back down where we started. Another one of these big inverted U's. And finally, we go to some efforts to try to measure the degree to which America has been culturally either individualistic or more communitarian, with a more sense of we're all in this together. And again, that trend now, it's not going to be surprising, is exactly the same trend. We start off very self-centered in the 1890s. We become gradually more focused on what we have in common, reaching a peak in the 1960s, and then going south and becoming relatively more polarized. Relatively more self-centered. The I alone president of Trump symbolizes that, but as you've heard from my description, Trump comes into the story very late. The problems that we're talking about did not begin when Trump entered the White House, and they won't end when Trump leaves the White House. That's the empirical findings that we're talking about, a big I curve.
And it's really a battle of individualism versus the common good.
Yeah.
Added to it is Shaylyn's work about the progressive movements. Both of you are doing this, but she's a scholar in this area. She's written about it before this book. The book draws inspiring lessons really from our time, from the progressive movement. It reminds us of how the progressive era brought the US out of the Gilded Age that you mentioned, out of corruption, polarization, deep inequality, maldistribution of wealth. Could you expand on that a bit and the importance of the progressive movement? And the questioning, I'll get back to it in the sense that, yes, it inspires us, but are we coming out of it at this point? Shaylyn.
Thanks, Jim. And I just want to echo Bob's thanks for the gracious invitation for us to be here and take part in this great series. The reason that this book focuses on the progressive era as an era from which we could draw lessons is really because of the striking similarity between the period we're living in today and the period of the Gilded Age. I mean, in digging into the historical record on the Gilded Age, it really was breathtaking to find how many similarities, not only just in the hard data that we present in the book, but in the lived experience of Americans having gone through a major shift demographically, economically with the Industrial Revolution, and feeling that the youngest generation of Americans were living in this totally changed world from the one that their parents had inhabited. And I think to a lot of young Americans, that feels familiar. And so the question then becomes, if America was in this mess once before, perhaps then, if ever there were a historical moment whose lessons we need to learn, it's the moment when that Gilded Age gave way to the progressive era. And just to be clear, we're not talking about progressivism in the same way that it's referenced today, which you might call small p progressivism, which of course we know refers to sort of the leftmost end of the political spectrum. When we're talking about the progressive era from the early 20th century, we're talking about what we might call capital P progressivism, which historians have described as a movement so diverse as to be barely coherent. This was a bipartisan movement. It was a movement consisting of competing factions that often didn't agree with one another. It was a movement that brought in people of all different stripes. And what really brought these progressives together was a compelling desire to repudiate the multidimensional crisis in which they found themselves, and a galvanizing belief in the power of ordinary citizens to do so. We often look at the progressive era and reference sort of the big national programs that came out of it, the trust busting, the child labor legislation, the consumer protections, the national income tax, the constitutional amendments that were passed. But those actually are sort of the tail end of this movement. The beginning of the movement was a movement that was very grassroots. And another surprising piece of this story of when the Gilded Age gave way to the Progressive Era, which we take as one of the central messages or lessons from this era, is the question of what was the driver of the change. But Bob described a story that's very statistical in nature, and our book is, the backbone of the book is, this scores and scores of hard measures documenting this I to we to I phenomenon. And so often you might ask the question, well, if you could indicate, if you could identify the leading indicator amongst all of these scores of measures, you might be able to find the sort of key lesson of this period, or a silver bullet of some kind that we could focus on today to bring up the same kind of multifaceted upswing that we saw before. And a lot of times people assume, and I think it's fair to say that Bob would say he assumed going into this, that the leading indicator was going to be economics. That the first thing America did was fix the economic inequality, and that brought the rest with it. And it actually turns out to be quite clear in the data that economics was a lagging indicator. It was actually the thing that changed last, which I think is a surprising finding, particularly amongst, a social science crowd who tends to think of economics as the leader. And what we found was significant indicators of the fact that what led this change and this movement was actually a cultural shift, a moral shift, what we often call a moral awakening. When the culture of the Gilded Age, the social Darwinism of that period, was really called into question, and you had reformers coming on the scene, both from the social gospel, which was a religious movement, but also from the broader movement. You had, Henry George and all of the people who were inspired by his writings to question the moral and ethical and values underpinnings of our society. And so it seems like the leading thrust of this shift from the Gilded Age to the Progressive Era was a rethinking of our nation's values and a reevaluating of the place of communitarianism relative to individualism. And so we think that that's likely going to be what we'll need to see today. There are a lot of other lessons that we can pull out of this, but I think that's one of the most thought-provoking ones, that it seems like culture-led.
Thank you. You're pointing out that you have good stories in the book besides a lot of data. I'm a data guy, I love data, but you have great stories. And one of the stories of the 20th century progressive era is that there was really a mix of idealism and pragmatism to change America, a desire to reform. Now, Teddy Roosevelt certainly took advantage of that. He was part of it. But do we currently have that combination of idealism and pragmatism in America to change where we are? Bob or Shaylyn, jump in, please.
Maybe we'll both try to respond to that because it's a big, important question. And the answer is, I don't know. We think that, we hope that there's a latent idealism in America. Another one of the lessons, by the way, Jim, as you know from reading the book, is that the young people, the progressives of that era, were all young people. They were not people our age, Jim, you and me. They were not even people Shaylyn's age. They were people in their 20s, most of them, who the leaders like Jane Addams and all the rest of them were young people. And they were the ones who led this moral reawakening. That's the idealistic side of it. Now, fast forward to our time now. What that means is it'll happen, we think, again, if and only if large numbers of young people in America forego the cynicism that they're perfectly entitled to. After all, young people today are the victims of this trend. They didn't cause this. They could easily say, well, look, you guys got us into a mess, I'm out of here. But what didn't happen, that didn't happen the last time we went through this. What did happen instead was that young people took it upon themselves to become more morally, to have a moral inflection to their concerns, and then to carry those into practice in many, many ways, grassroots and so on across the country. Are we ready for that? I think the real question is, are young people ready for that? I'm actually encouraged, very encouraged by the fact that right now, a lot of the reform movements, not only in the United States, but around the world, are led by young people. Greta Thunberg, for example, who's leading the fight against global warming, is just a kid, frankly, and she is the driver of this. That's what it will look like. Or the kids from the Stoneham, I'm sorry, blanking on the name of the
Marjorie Stoneman Douglas.
Marjorie Stoneham Douglas High School. They're the ones who are leading gun control. It's not old folks who are leading that. And that's what it will look like, Jim, if we are now about to enter a period of greater idealism and greater pragmatism. The question you've asked about the importance of pragmatism is very real. Indeed, pragmatism as a political philosophy, I mean, as a way of looking at the world, begins actually exactly in this period. The pragmatists, the leading pragmatists, are the people who are part of the progressive era then. And the term didn't have quite the practical meaning it did now, but it did have the meaning of learning from experience. Mm-hmm. And so what I very much hope is that if we're going to enter another period, that it means it means being idealistic in the sense of having high moral standards, but it means being practical in the sense of learning from experience all across the country. Shaylyn, it's your period. What have I forgotten?
Well, I would just maybe add that much like then, and another similarity between then and now is that I think to young people, both populism and socialism felt like popular alternatives. And what was really brilliant about the progressive era was that it found sort of a middle way, right? And so I think there is a question of whether the idealism of young people will get channeled into ideologies like socialism, or whether it will get channeled into the practical labor in the sort of laboratories of democracy at the local level. And so what inspires me the most is young people who are thinking really local. I mean, I love the Greta Thunbergs who are thinking really big and are putting really important moral language around huge problems. But, through the Weave initiative, the whole point of that initiative is to go out and find and highlight people across the United States who are working just on their own block, just in their own neighborhood, to create a different sort of culture of communitarianism. That was already, happening before the pandemic. The hope is that the pandemic gave another shot in the arm to that hyper local thinking. And one thing that encourages me about the youngest generation is really the social entrepreneurship that we're seeing. There are some I think traps and hurdles for that particular movement in terms of how it's funded and other things. But I think that impetus to solve problems right where you are is something that really mirrors the genius of the progressive era. And if we can lean into that, I think there's a lot of hope there.
Well, the progressive era also brought much more cooperation and cohesion in the nation. And some would say that these are one-off issues, very important issues like global warming, gun control, redistribution of wealth. But it seems to me that we don't have that cooperation and cohesion in this nation at this point. What do you think?
Well, we don't have it. Of course, they didn't have it either, right? They didn't start with cohesion. They started in a highly divisive environment where I think the way I'd put it is Shaylyn and I are, when we wrote the book, were confident that we were in the Gilded Age stage today. And then everything that's happened the last year has made us a little more hopeful that maybe we're beginning to enter the progressive era part of this. And that would mean, could we find ways to cooperate now, today, across political lines? Recognizing, I totally recognize the degree of polarization right now, I mean, this week, in the responses, for example, to the shootings all the shootings, but especially these most recent shootings in Denver. So if you are using these national level metrics of politicization, of polarization, I think you have to be pretty discouraged. Maybe you want to get into this later, but I believe actually that the reaction of the public to the $1.9 billion stimulus package, the American
Rescue Plan,
American Rescue Plan, the reaction in Congress to that is extremely polarized. No Republicans supported that. All the Democrats supported that. But if you look at the public opinion polls and the attitudes of people state and local officials, but even more ordinary people, that is much less polarized. That is 70% and 70% or 80% of all Americans approve of that program. And it's a very both big P and small p progressive a bit of legislation. And yet, I've not seen the latest numbers, but probably 40 to 50% of Republican voters approve of that policy. So I don't want to get way off on a limb and say we've solved all the problems, but I do want to say that's what it will look like. Remember, the change in the last time we went through this did not start with big national level collaboration. It started by ordinary people and local, state and local people finding that what they had in common turned out to be they had more in common than they had thought they did, and they began to work in common on shared problems. That's my optimistic hope, Jim.
Right. Some people say that when there is consensus in society about a clear problem and a threat, then it's easier to have a clear consensus about solution. And maybe this first bill is that way. World War II and the Great Depression certainly brought us together, but the pandemic is a little different. They support of the bill, but why is it so divisive on masks, vaccinations, social distancing, school openings? It's all highly politicized. What's the explanation of that?
Well, it's not only highly politicized, but it's touching areas that really, I think, ignite in people that hyper individualism, right? I mean, so it's not just political, it's cultural. It's that, I mean, because I live in Utah, one of the places that's been one of these hotbeds of anti-masking protests and all sorts of, this type of reaction, right? I'm not taking the pandemic seriously, mistrusting all of the experts, you name it, it's happened in my state at a pretty significant level. And oddly, when I encounter it, it feels to me less political and more of a don't tread on me. I'll take care of myself and my own. Don't tell me what to do, which is itself deeply steeped in that hyper individualism. And so it's interesting because for me, when I look at the legislation, I am optimistic, as Bob says, but I wonder how durable the cultural shift underneath it is. I don't know. And that to me is what I'm waiting to see is when are we going to have the voices rising up to say enough is enough? The hyper individualism is what caused the problem being 3 times bigger than it might have been otherwise. We still don't really have those clear voices or any kind of agreement about that narrative, right? And that worries me that I don't know that we can legislate our way into a moral shift. But it could be that, yes, as Bob points out, that the opinion data shows that people are ready for legislation that reflects a new morality. I don't know. I mean, to me, it feels too soon to tell. Maybe that's just based on where I'm sitting in the country.
Well, we're highly sorted in the United States with the South and the so-called cowboy states, cowboy areas in America that are pushing for individualism. I come from Oregon. My wife's the state of Washington, and east of the Cascades in those states, it's exactly like your description of Utah in most places, really pushing individualism. The question is, what are the consequences of the 2020 election and Biden's policies with respect to this, to the I, we, I cycle? Once they start receiving help, will they change? Will there be an upswing when that hits? Is there an upswing going on right now as a result of that? Some people say that you're too optimistic about reducing political tribalism and what I would call asymmetric polarization. It's polarization mainly on the far right, in my opinion.
First of all, Jim, you raised a lot of really important questions. And first of all, on that last point, asymmetric, it is asymmetric. The political science literature is perfectly clear that it's asymmetric, and we talk about that, and it's just a fact. I'm sorry, it's a fact. And right. I'm not apologizing to you. It's a fact that this polarization has been much more severe on the right than it is on the left.
I wanted to get you a chance to say that.
Can I just say 2 other things, Jim? And one of them may sound defensive. I hope it doesn't. As we've tried to emphasize, we are historians. We're not by nature commenters on what's happening this week in Washington. And for us, the long run is measured in decades, and the short run is measured in years. It's an unnatural act for me to try to say whether what's going to happen tomorrow compared to what happened today, and even to attempt to think about the long run consequences of the $1.9 trillion package is, as I say, it's an unnatural act. We're doing it. I did it, but it's not our area of expertise, and I'm not kind of professionally committed to that, because who knows? I mean, it's from, if you'd picked America in, I don't know, 1901, who knows what you would have predicted about the long run, even though the long run trend turns out to be quite clear. There are a lot of short run. The second thing I want to say is, and this has not been so widely noticed, but is highlighted by the IWI distinction. The pandemic didn't have to be this way. The 1918-19 pandemic was not this, but this pandemic, because of the nature of this virus and how it spreads, is intrinsically an IWI phenomenon, because I wear the mask not to protect me, but to protect you. You wear the mask really not to protect yourself, but to protect me. So wearing masks, if you're in a we society, well, I worry about you, and therefore in a we society, it makes sense to wear masks. But in an I society, it's completely nonsensical. I mean, if I'm looking only about myself, it's not just this is an accidental correlation between Republican or Trump views and wearing masks. It's intrinsic to the logic of, I don't know if this is making sense or not, intrinsic to the logic of the problem. I could go through the math of that. It's a classic dilemma of collective action. And you can only resolve that, you can only get out of this situation in which each of us is spewing germs in the other guy's face, if you're willing to believe that we're all in this together. If you believe that we're all in this together, then it's clear you should wear masks. If you believe we're not all in this together, so I'm sorry, that's getting maybe a little too technical on the game theory side, but it wouldn't be true of all pandemics even. This particular virus triggers that I clash.
But behind it, isn't there this distrust of government, especially by the far right, and a leader that reinforced that and didn't take these issues of the mask and distancing very seriously? In other words, leadership made a difference and helped politicize it a bit more.
Yeah,
you mentioned that.
Shaylyn, you want to say something? I don't want to make it sound like just because Shaylyn lives in Trump territory that it's her president, but you may.
No, I mean, I just would agree with what Jim said, not just in the sense of Trump having not taken it seriously, but in Trump personally modeling that hyper-individualist stance on masks, which, when I think about the young mothers who are my contemporaries in my neighborhood who were organizing anti-mask protests, it wasn't about politics. It wasn't about Trump for them. It was about, this is bad for my child. So I put my child first. It was literally an individualistic logic, which of course was being role modeled at the top.
Right. Now, earlier, Bob, you mentioned that there's significant support for this $1.9 billion trillion, whatever. Yeah, right. Trillion.
It all blurs at some point, right?
All right, exactly as Dirksen said. But behind that, you said that there's not a lot of support here in Washington, especially by the Republicans, and some people would say that the movement to restrict voting, partisan redistricting, the unrepresentativeness of the Electoral College, the effects of the filibuster, the malapportioned Senate with rural states having so much power. I know you, as a historian, you explained the past and you don't want to predict the future, but since you said you were into helping America get better, I'm going to ask, do we need fundamental reform like HR 1, S1, that's about 40 different pieces of reform to help have better access to the ballot, to help commissions do redistricting, to clean up money in politics, and a variety of other things? Do we need something like that right now?
Yes. I mean, I could go on to say more, and I maybe should say more, but the answer is yes, we do. You know, I would hope, and frankly, I think so. The administration, I'm not close to the administration, but I think they probably hope that, you know, since it can't be kept off the floor by the Senate leadership now, as it was for a long time, it may force Republican senators to actually have to take a vote on it. And it may be that there'll be a significant number of Republican senators who will be, at that point, feel they really just have to support what actually, for goodness sakes, the original Voting Rights Act, which is what, it's partly what's at stake here, that was a Republican as much as a Democratic initiative. I mean, it really was. And so it's not like it's kind of a strange thing for a Republican to support equal voting rights. They were on that side of the issue originally, and maybe some of them still are. I mean, for example, it'd be interesting to know whether Shaylyn's distant cousin, how he would vote if he were forced to vote, if he is going to be forced to vote on HR 1. But that may not happen. And if you ask me, it has to happen. I mean, I just don't, there's no way that we're going to get to a better America unless, and not least, the issue of race, which we haven't talked about much, but is central to this whole thing. There's no way we can get to a better America without having, better American democracy without solving that problem. I mean, for example, stimulus package is great, but the fundamentals of American democracy can't be fixed until we give basically everybody an equal chance at taking part in the fundamental power of democracy, namely the elections. How do I feel about the ability to stifle through the sorry, Alzheimer's strikes, the filibuster, thank you. Well, I think the filibuster is a crazy idea, and the filibuster origins are entirely in racism. That's where it comes from originally. And that's what's fundamentally always been about. And it's a racist process. And, you know, it has some side effects. Maybe people, some of its defenders, including some of its Democratic defenders, would say, yeah, but it does force there to be some bipartisanship on major issues, but it's now being way overused. That's my personal judgment, way overused. And if you ask me to vote, I would vote to, and we're on the agenda, I would vote to abolish the filibuster, period. But, you know, we all know that's politically going to be hard because there are a number of Democrats who would not vote to abolish the filibuster. And I would therefore, as a practical matter of politics, I'd be prepared to have to make the kinds of reforms that are being talked about now, which is to at least make people have to stand up and do the Jimmy Stewart kind of thing, and not just submit a piece of paper that says I veto this bit of legislation. That's just, I'm sorry to go on so long, Jim, but you now invited me to become a pundit about today's events, literally today's events, and that's what I would say. Yes, HR 1 is an absolutely fundamental part of any reform program, and probably we can't get to the really big issues unless we abolish the fundamentally racist procedures in the Senate.
It sounds like you're like President Biden. You would go with the standing filibuster reform, make them stand, make them talk, bring the bill to the floor, and if that doesn't work, then go to the next step and get rid of it. And
that's right, Jim. But keep in mind, you're the expert here on what's happening in Washington. I'm not the expert. I'm just a pundit. I'm just an ordinary citizen saying what I think should be done.
Oh, come on. Shaylyn, do you want to weigh in on this?
Well, I just wanted to add one thing and then we could move on. The thing I wanted to add is that, you know, again, we tend to look back at the progressive era and think of the social programs and the safety nets and you know, things like that. And those were a big part, but it was also the biggest burst of constitutional amendments since the since the Bill of Rights. And so, and what were some of those amendments? They were dealing with the direct election of US senators and women's suffrage. I mean, really important reforms about the nature of democracy itself. And that is what we mean when we're referring to this being a movement that asked people to reconsider the fundamentals of society. And so in a sense, we're seeing kind of an analog in terms of the things that are being debated today, and the outcomes are unsure. I mean, so much of it depends on how many ordinary Americans get behind the push for this, rather than just, saying, well, that's all just Washington stuff that doesn't relate to me. It has nothing to do with me, which I think is what a lot of Americans do these days.
Remember, and Jim, you know this, of course, it's not just their analogous political reforms that were being discussed then and now. It's exactly the same reforms as being. It was for example, campaign finance. The first campaign finance bills came out of the progressive era, and they lasted for much of this period. And then when we get to the peak of the IWI curve, they begin to be diminished. And now we're back exactly where we were, precisely. Big monopolies with lots of money controlling Congress. That's exactly the same issue. And the other thing to remember is we're dealing here with huge differences in scope. That is to say, if you're dealing at the decade-long change, it looks like it happened pretty quickly. But if you were down actually in Congress in 1910 or whenever the national campaign finance legislation occurred, there were moments in which it looked like it wasn't going to work, and moments in which it did look like it worked. And so I'm only calling attention to the fact that I'm inviting it, but I'm calling attention to the fact the real challenge is moving from the macro level that the book is intended to talk about, and where we're pretty expert, down to the micro level, which is measure in which we're basically just another pair of commentators.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things I found quite interesting in the book is that after the stock market crash of 1929, government slowly stepped in to provide a social safety net, and things got better and better. And by the early 1960s, you conclude that, quote, America had been transformed into a more egalitarian, cooperative, cohesive and altruistic nation. But then sometime during mid to late 60s, that's when I was going to college.
Mm-hmm. Me too.
You too, I know. However, these trends reversed and leaving us in today's disarray. Why was that the case? After decades of progress, the pendulum swang back in the other direction. You say that period was, people were very interested in individualism, but I may disagree with you here a bit. I think the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement during that period, other things, they were thinking about the collective, the common good. It wasn't all about individualism. I don't want you to, I think we shouldn't overstate Haight-Ashbury and individualism that was going along with the hippies. You don't do that. But
no, I mean, Jim, I'm sorry, go ahead. I'm eager to talk about this question, but
you got it. You got my
go ahead.
No, that's fine.
As you well know, Jim, having lived through it, and you also know the literature, the 60s, but most people don't. The 60s was actually two different periods, and much of it spilled into the 70s. So we use 60s as a shorthand, but the first half of the 60s was actually a very communitarian period, and both in the numbers and actually in the lived experience of Americans. That was the peak. The first half of the 60s was the peak of we-ness. And it was, you can say that was true in the communes, but it was also true in the sense of people thinking that they were working for shared national values, and including the communes, but the communes are only the visible part of it. And then exactly in the middle 60s, America does this kind of backflip, and we come out of the 60s in a very I period. What pundits, and this is not us looking back at it, pundits at the time in the 70s said, we've entered an I period in America. The me period in America, it was said at the time, began as the 70s opened. So the first point is the 60s were complicated. The second point is it's complicated, not just in general, it's complicated, but in the particular point that you could point to parts of the 60s that were very communitarian, which, I mean, I'm probably a little older than you, and I came of age in the early 60s. So when I went to college in 59, I graduated in 63, and actually, let me tell you a story. I'm sorry, this is a little bit relevant. In In 1960, I was a sophomore. I took a course in political science. I happened to sit next to a really cute co-ed, in the language of the time. We started hanging out together. And I was a Republican. I was a Nixon for our first date was we went to a Nixon rally. Our second date was we went to a John Kennedy rally because she was a firm Democrat. By the end of that semester, I had converted. And on January 19th, we got on the train we were in Philadelphia. We got on the train in Philadelphia and ended up down at at the main train station in Washington and walked to the east front of the Capitol building, which, as you know, was where the inaugurations were held then. And I can take you to the very tree under which we stood. And I heard Jack Kennedy say with my own ears, ask not what the country can do for you, ask what you can do for the country. And I thought he was speaking to me personally. That moment is when I became a social scientist and a communitarian, that moment. And it is crazy because the hair on the back of my neck, I'm now 80, the hair on the back of my neck, it still stands up because it was such a big movement. I thought that was reveille for a new awakening. It turned out that was not reveille, that was taps. Historically, that was the last gasp of this communitarian America. And within 10 years, we were going the other direction. And I probably have already said much more than I need to about the 60s, but what I'm trying to say is it was at the beginning a very much communitarian America, but then over a series of otherwise unrelated effects, of which, again, Jim, I'm going to tell you things you know very well. Part of it was the assassinations. And older Americans always begin by telling you the story with the assassinations, but part of it was Vietnam. Part of it was the pill. Part of it was the changed norms and the fact that people were now all engaging in what at the time to older people seemed like craziness, which is premarital sex. Part of it was gang violence. Part of it was pure violence of the Patty Hearst sort. Part of it was race. A large part of it was race, but part of it was not just about race. And then part of it, as I say, was about Vietnam, and then part of it was about the gas lines and the high inflation and the economic travail and so on. And so there were many, many things. There was not a single story you could tell about. And only people who have never lived through it would ever think the 60s could use the 60s as if it were a single homogenous thing. It was a very different thing. That's why we talk about that in the book, but we try to shy away from saying, well, it was all caused by, I don't know, Vietnam or something.
Right, you don't in the book. I just wanted you to talk about it. And in the book, we haven't talked much about it. You have separate chapters on race and gender. And that's so important to what happened in the last, from the founding, but especially in the last 120 years.
Absolutely.
How significant do you think race and gender affected your analysis and your conclusions?
Oh boy, Shaylyn, you do that. Shaylyn actually drafted those chapters. I agree with every word that's in them, and I helped with some of the data, but Shaylyn, you tell the story.
Shaylyn, please.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, no discussion of we in American society can fail to address the questions of race and gender, especially during the 20th century, right? And it's a little bit of a puzzle in one sense, right? These decades that we are supposedly lauding for being this period of increasing solidarity and we feeling were also the decades that corresponded with racial violence and Jim Crow. I mean, racial violence has always been a part of American history, but it's hard to talk about, us coming together in this we spirit while, Black Americans were being, excluded and killed, frankly. And so that does beg the question, sort of, how does race figure into this I century that we're trying to tell the story of? And as we really looked at the data, a few things were clear. One is that we tend to have this view of the 20th century as a story of basically no progress for Black Americans until the lightning bolt changes of the civil rights revolution, right? The idea that all was exclusion and oppression and lack of equality. And for a lot of measures, that's actually true. When we're talking just about inclusion, that's a true story for, Black Americans were excluded from professional schools and professions and were not represented adequately in the political sphere, and were suffering under the weight of widespread white supremacy in mainstream culture and in the media. And all of those things did not change basically until the 1960s. The story's not quite the same, however, when we're talking about equality. Now, equality and inclusion are two different things. But it's interesting that when you look at material equality between the races, you actually see a fairly, a surprising amount of progress happening toward parity, material parity between white and Black Americans before the civil rights movement. The fastest rate of a trend toward equality between the races actually happened between 1940 and 1970. And then after the civil rights movement, after that 1970 period, what you see is actually a leveling off of that progress, and on some individual measures, a reversal of progress over the last half century. So it's this puzzle where the story that we often tell ourselves about the 20th century is that, nothing changed for Black Americans until the civil rights movement, and then everything got better after the civil rights movement. That story isn't entirely true. And what we found was that the positive change for Black Americans was actually faster in those we decades when it comes to material progress than it was during the I decades. Now, there's a lot of different, threads that we could pull on here to try to explain what's going on there. But essentially, one piece of this story is that to the extent that Black Americans were indeed moving into the we in the sense of material equality, it was due almost entirely to their own efforts. In two ways. One, in terms of the long civil rights movement, which didn't just start in the 1950s. Historians are now beginning to emphasize much more clearly that it began way back in the 1900s. And it was a long process of claiming a place for Black Americans in the we. But the other piece of that story is, of course, the Great Migration. Millions of Black Americans migrating out of the South and into the North, where they could access opportunities that were still racialized, but were nonetheless vast improvements over what they were experiencing in the South. And then, however, right, when you would think, right at the peak of the we, when we pass legislation to legally expand the we in America, you would think that already on its way upward trajectory toward equality would have accelerated, but it did not. The opposite happened. It stagnated. And so you have to ask the question, what happened? And a huge piece of that story is simply white backlash. And this is what I'm sort of feeling my way towards when we were talking a little bit about whether you could legislate our way into morality, right? So we had legislation that passed that widened the we, but when it came time for the Johnson administration to implement integration and to ask white Americans to actually share the pie, there was a huge not in my backyard backlash. And to a certain extent, the stagnation in Black communities is a result of that. And so we did the work legally, but we hadn't done the heart work of racial reconciliation. And the progressives themselves kicked that down the road. They expanded, they had this moral awakening, but their circle of moral concern sort of left race and to a certain extent gender to the side. And that's the result of that was that, in the very peak of this we period that the progressives had supposedly been leading us toward or had initiated, things began to unravel, I think largely because we hadn't fully done the work under the surface to widen that we in a significant moral, values-oriented way. And so there's a lot to be learned from race, and to a certain extent gender. The story there is a little bit different, and maybe I might leave that for another discussion, but the story is not cleanly a confirmation of I, we, I, but it is a confirmation of I, we, I in a lot of interesting ways, in the sense that the moment we took our foot off the gas in driving toward full equality is also the moment that more broadly we took a nosedive back toward I.
Can I just add one
Thank you.
a quick comment to that, Jim? It goes back to the fact that our book and all this analysis, all the analysis that Shaylyn just gave was done before this year, before 2020, and therefore before the Black Lives Matter movement. We knew nothing about the Black Lives Matter movement at the time. I mean, not the one in St. Louis, but the big one last summer. And yet it fits perfectly with this story. That is to say, I'm now looking back, trying to say where the Black Lives Matter movement came. Of course, it came partly from police brutality and George Floyd and that, but much of it was because those people, mostly blacks, but also now increasingly large numbers of young white people, knew that there had not been any progress in terms of toward racial parity since the 60s. They, Black Americans themselves certainly knew, and they were, a technical term, pissed, as they should have been, because the promise of the Civil Rights Revolution had actually completely vanished, at least as far as material equality is concerned. Fewer relatively speaking, by 2021, fewer blacks own homes than in 1965 when we passed the Fair Housing Act. And that's a mark of how much stagnation there's been. That part of the story is in our book. The part that isn't is, but now it's perfectly clear, that exploded in and around, all over America last summer.
Well, your book fits perfectly into the dialogue on American democracy, and I pushed you beyond explanation. Historians, political scientists have difficulty explaining what has happened in the past. You did a nice job with your data doing that, and I want to thank you for taking my questions about prediction. We don't do prediction very well, and then you went even further. Most of us are talking about what is, not what ought to be, but you both are going into what ought to be, the normative side of things. And I thank you very much. I think it's time to open this up to the hundreds of people who've been watching this. They have questions, and David Barker is going to be the controller of the questions, and he will pose them to you, if that's all right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, James.
Thanks a lot, Jim, and thanks to both of you. I thoroughly enjoyed that. Thanks so much to both of you for making us all a little bit smarter. So I'm going to go ahead and start launching through these questions. We have quite a few of them. We'll see how many we can get through. So the first is from Amanda Brazana Rios. I'm not sure I pronounced that correctly, but she asks, how important do you feel fraternal organizations, like the Grange, for example, she references, will be in turning the tide to a next upswing?
Shaylyn, you want to do that, or should I? We can either do that.
You go ahead. You're the expert on fraternal organizations for sure, between the two of us.
It seems like it's queued up pretty well.
Bowling leagues.
Look, like bowling leagues. This is a really big question. Do I think that there will be new forms of connecting? Hard to predict exactly what they'll be, but new forms of connecting, including connecting face to face. Absolutely, I do. And really, especially organizational connections that reach across the other barriers of class and race and so on in our society. Those face-to-face connections are important. So that's the simple answer to the question. It leads up to, but I'm not going to go very far down that route. Well, okay, so we're no longer bowling in leagues together, but how about Facebook? Doesn't that solve the problem? And my short answer to that is social media are really important, but they're not even the equivalent of, much less better than, face-to-face connections. And I used to have to make a hard argument to convince people that, face-to-face connections are really pretty important. But after the last 12 months, I don't think I have to convince anybody in America. Everybody in America knows that you need to hug your grandma, and it's not enough to see her on Zoom. That's the perfect proof that we need. I mean, it's a trivial example, but that's true across America. We are going to have to form new forms of connecting face-to-face with other people.
Could I just add a thought there as well? I mean, I think that bringing up fraternal organizations is really interesting because, some of the most inspiring thinkers, I think, around how are we going to reinvent face-to-face community are actually dissecting things like the organizations of the past and saying, okay, what were the component parts? They had ritual, they had commitment, they had roles and responsibilities for everyone, and learning those components of what community feels and looks like, and then asking ourselves how to reinvent those for the modern era. So rather than reviving the institutions of another era, it's what threads can we learn from what they did really well? What was underlying the power of those associations, and how can we bring those up to date in the modern era? I think that's the fascinating question.
This links directly to the issues about race and gender, because fraternal organizations, by definition, fraternal, are male, but there were plenty of women's organizations of exactly, they were segregated, but they were powerful. And there were plenty of Black fraternal organizations and Black sororal organizations. That's one of the things that our current vice president emphasizes, is the role of the Black sorority at
Howard.
At Howard, right. So those were part of that earlier period, but the earlier period didn't get to the further stage of actually integrating across those lines. And that's an example of what we think needs to be done differently this time.
Isn't it a little more complex right now with respect to some of these organizations? Like, you document the decline of, quote, what I would call the thinking churches, and you don't spend a lot of time on the growth of evangelical churches that get involved in all kinds of different dimensions in people's lives. I'm not calling the Mormon church evangelical, but it gets involved in all kinds of elements of a person's life, and it helps people. That seems to be growing among the evangelicals.
Jim, you know that and you may not have known, Shaylyn was also co-author of a book called American Grace, which was a huge, big 600-page doorstop about the role of religion, including the role, for an academic, I prove that religious people are nicer, but not because they're religious people, but because the organizations of religious organizations are incredibly powerful at building ties. So yes, that's certainly, and the fact that there's been some falling away from religion, actually falling away from religion in general, but some falling away from especially the mainline churches and so on, is a problem for our nowadays. But I guess I want to, in talking about churches, say we should, even those of us who are secular, got to be very careful about not writing off the power of religion, and not just evangelical religion, today in America. There are huge and growing numbers of Catholics in America, not because native-born Catholics are sort of suddenly seeing the light, but because of all these Spanish, and for that matter, Korean and other immigrants coming here. And the voice of Pope Francis is, from my point of view, the most important moral voice in America today. I don't mean he's a perfect guy, but he's drawing on that deep religious, normative, moral, not just organizational, moral voice that the church has. I'm not a Catholic at all, but I'm trying to say we've got to be really careful. Those of us who are more secular got to be really careful about writing off churches are not part of this. I don't mean you were doing this, but writing off that. Now, of course, there gets a lot of attention to a particular part of the evangelical movement, which is the more conservative evangelical movement. It's not even the whole evangelical movement, and that is important. I don't mean to say this it's not important, but and I agree that that part of the religious spectrum is not really yet on board with this this idea of moving toward a more we-based society. It's just, we shouldn't, because it's the part of religion that's gotten the most attention. It's not actually the most important part of religion today in America, even organizationally. It's just a tiny part of all of religion in America. You know that.
That serves as a nice way to segue to the next question, I think, from Michael Mazie, who says the founders discussed political virtue, leaders and citizens privileging the public interest over one's self-interest. Do you see evidence of political virtue in American politics and society today?
First of all, I assume the line here spells Macy in a way that I don't understand, but I'm assuming this is actually could be the Mike Macy that I know. If that's not right.
No, I think that's right.
Yes.
It is right or isn't right?
Yep, I think it is.
Okay, Mike, hi. That's even though I can't see you. I believe, first of all, I very much am sympathetic with that strain of civic republicanism that was dominant in America at the founding. And they found it really easy to talk about virtue. Virtue now sounds a little dated as a concept. So if you ask me, well, how much virtue is there in America today? I'm not quite sure what I'd say empirically. But if you use the language of morality or morals, I think, and this goes back to what we were talking about before, I do think that there's hidden reserves of moral discussion in America today. Certainly not enough. And we've made that clear. We think that that's an important, indeed we would say that's the single most important prerequisite, to begin talking in moral terms about our society and not just in utilitarian terms. And that's, I suppose, in that slightly older language, it's saying we believe, as most of the founders did, that civic virtue was a precondition for having a stable democracy, or republic, as they would have put it. And so, yes, I think I completely agree that that's a discourse that needs reviving.
And maybe I would just add that, it's one thing to hear what we're saying is like, oh, what we need today is a religious revival and a moral awakening. And that seems a little bit hard to imagine exactly what that's going to look like in modern American society. But I do think that going back to this idea of inventing new ways of bringing people together, which is what the progressives did, I do see evidence of that. I mean, for example, I think of something called Citizen University out in Seattle, run by Eric Liu, who is actually trying to take the idea of religiosity and create what he calls a civic analog to church. He's created civic Saturdays, right? So taking the power of the way that religion brings people together, but then orienting that that technology, so that social technology, so to speak, of religion toward civic virtue, toward democratic values. And I think that that's a really interesting experiment for how to create a new form of civic religiosity that could be a source of virtue and moral formation for folks who don't find themselves particularly attracted to a church or religion-based morality, right? So I think there's room for innovation here that we are seeing, and that's a hopeful sign.
Great. So the next one is from David Simpson, who asks, as an economist, I'm curious as to the leading or lagging indication of economics. While economics might not have led out of the crisis, did the panics of 1893 and 1907 lead into it, as the dot-com crash of 2000 and the Great Recession of 2008-9 might have been leading indicators of our recent decline in social trust?
Yeah, maybe Shaylyn, because it's a more statistical question. I can answer that. The answer is yes. When we say economics was a lagging indicator, what we mean was we mean economic equality or economic inequality. That dimension of not all academic, we're not talking about all things economic, but we're talking particularly the economic inequality variable was a laggard moving in. We didn't begin to have movements toward greater economic inequality in the progressive era until decades after we had the moral change and the organizational changes and so on that we talked about. And it's true on the other side, on the way out, we don't begin to see economic inequality rise really until the 70s, which is after all these other things rise. So that's what I meant when I said economics is a lagging variable, but I meant economic inequality. You're absolutely right. Sorry, I've forgotten the name of the questioner. He or she is absolutely right that the crises of the late 19th century were symptoms of this extremely unequal society, and they did help to trigger. They triggered, as the questioner perfectly well knows, and as we discuss this in the book, triggered very large levels of unemployment, very large levels of economic pain for ordinary people, and a second order effect was to encourage unionization. By the way, unionization matches this curve exactly. The unionization is completely replicates this, and so maybe we can hope that the crash. I mean, it's hard to say, isn't it? Be hopeful, but maybe we can hope that in retrospect it'll turn out that the crash of 2008 was a big enough deal that it began to shift people's thinking. If we switch up to the not at the year by year level, but up to the decade by decade level, I can easily imagine that that's true. And even more, the economic hard times of the last year, I think actually probably has played a significant role in raising the prominent, and it's not just the economy, of course, it's also the pandemic, have shown so vividly how many people have been left out of the American dream, that I think it's now gotten harder for lots of ordinary people, forget about politics, lots of ordinary people just know that they and it's going to be hard to just go to unknow how big the gaps were in American society during the economic and medical or health problems.
And just a quick add on to that, it's not just the panics, right? It's also the massive economic shifts. You have to remember that during the Industrial Revolution, wage labor itself was a fairly new concept, right? And so unionization rose up in response not just to the panics, but to the idea that all of a sudden workers realized that they'd been put into this completely disempowered position. That's extremely analogous to what we're seeing with the gig economy right now, right? And that has been a huge economic shift where suddenly a whole new category of employment has been invented that we ran with for a little while until we realized that it was running people into the ground. And so I think that more than just these panics is probably going to drive some rethinking of how we organize the economy around, how we take care of everyone, right?
Yeah. So Janet Walker asks, aren't so many of the changes in the early and mid 20th century a result of 2 world wars? Those catastrophic wars led to a grand mixing and rethinking of culture and how best to move forward.
Shaylyn, you want to do this or shall I do it?
Sure. I mean, that's a pretty common view of the 20th century, right? We have to acknowledge that and it's important to acknowledge that essentially the upswing is providing a bit of an alternative story to that oft accepted idea that it was the wars and the Depression that really led America coming together. What's clear from the data, I think, is that these curves, these trends were well on their way before the world wars and before the Depression, right? And so it's a little bit hard to argue that those crises and those wars were the cause of something that actually had roots decades before. So that's one thing to point out. I think it's also relevant to point out that we often do that. In retrospect, we tend to think of World War I as this big deal for America, but actually, relatively speaking, a relatively few number of Americans were involved in World War I, and I don't think that it had quite the cultural and salience as it did in Europe, in the United States. And so we tend to, in retrospect, think of it as this huge disruptive thing, which I don't think at the time it was quite experienced in that way.
Moreover, I'm sorry, we have other questions. I don't want to say 2 things really. Moreover, the progressive era was ended by World War I. That every historian agrees that the progressive era was ended by World War I. It could hardly be the cause of the progressive era when it ended the progressive era. That's the World War I story. And the other thing to keep in mind is the curve keeps going up for 25 years after World War II, rising. And it's hard to believe that the world, if you look at the data, there is a little bit of an effect of World War II. Of course there is. It was a big deal. But it's a little bit of a blip on this big curve, which then keeps rising for another 25 years. It's hard to explain that in terms of World War II.
And when you look at when you look at the intellectual history, again, the idea that culture was what was leading this, people were talking about rethinking our values, coming together, association as an end and a means to reforming society in the 1880s and 90s. So that this is well before any of that 20th century disruption came onto the scene.
So there are probably 20 additional great questions that unfortunately we're not going to have time to get to, but I am going to ask one more because it's from one of your former students, Bob, a PhD from 1994 when you were department chair. So it's Alan Levine, who's now one of Jim and my colleagues here at AU. He asks, how does and it's kind of a long question, but it's a good one. How does immigration policy correspond to the upside down U of your findings? In particular, several historians have argued that the immigration restrictions of the progressive era contributed to the feeling of national solidarity that helped to support the New Deal. Do you accept that immigration limitations helped to build national solidarity? Might the new immigration policies starting in 1965 have helped to undermine it? Are there implications of that for today?
So I'm delighted that it's a former student of mine that's asked that really tough question. And it's actually, the answer is simple, but it's a little hard to explain. So let me try to do it quickly. Immigration causes disruption and hunkering down. I famously argued that. It was unpopular with some of my left-wing people. The people in the right wing who read that part of the story loved me. And I was, and it's been the use of, I was for a little while, because of that argument, that is saying immigration disrupts community and causes people to hunker down. I was for a while, I'm sorry to say, the face of David Duke's website. Okay, that's terrible. The second part of that argument is actually also relevant, which is what I said was, that's the short run effect of immigration. The long run effect of immigration in a successful immigration society is that over the next 20 years, and the data on this is quite clear, it's about 20 to 30 years, those differences are, the actual term should be assimilated, although the word assimilation has itself gotten involved and has ideological overtones that I don't want to include here. But the integration of a new group of immigrants occurs gradually over a 20 to 30 year period. And in fact, it's very clear. It's the first generation speaks only Italian, the second generation speaks both Italian and English, the third generation speaks only English. That's a quite general point. And then you can understand why at the peak of the we curve is actually also the peak of, it's when we open the gates to immigration, because by then the assimilation process that occurred in Americans were all comfortable with immigration. And then we then opened the door to immigration because we were comfortable with the wider we. Not an accident that it was that same period. And then what happened? Well, a lot more people came in, and then what happened? Well, it took time for them to become assimilated, and so the effects of that is, and this is all, I'm trying to summarize the mathematical evidence here. Where I'm going is, if you adjust for the inevitable time that it takes, I'm not making the number up, it's in the data, this is not ex post facto, it takes roughly 20 or 30 years to assimilate. If you adjust for that, the immigration curve fits precisely our curve. I mean, the curves look exactly right. It's just a matter of translating them, translating the immigration curve a little, 3 decades to the right. I'm not making up the 3 decades just to fit the data. It's what we know is true. So the long and the short of it is, immigration, far from being an exception to the IWI curve, perfectly conforms to the IWI curve. And it also, another thing that should be happening is, about now, those immigrants should be sufficiently assimilated that in the younger generation, those immigration differences should be lower. And I'm just reading off from the numbers of what you should expect. And lo and behold, what do we find? Young people today are perfectly happy with people of different ethnic backgrounds, including different, immigration backgrounds. That is entirely consistent with the IWI curve, as long as you understand that the assimilation doesn't occur instantly, but it rather occurs over a 20 or 30 year period.
Wow. Well, I think this was a terrific culmination to our Thurber Dialogues and Democracy this semester. And I know that I don't speak for just myself when I say that I think we're all a little bit smarter, and I don't know, maybe even a little bit more committed to each other tonight than we were. So at this point, so Jim's not expecting this, he doesn't know this, but if you'll stick with us and indulge me for just another minute here, on behalf of the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies that Professor Thurber founded and directed for 37 years, the department that he more or less built and served for even longer than that, and the university that he came to personify, I want to take just another moment now to present him with a small token of our gratitude. Jim, in the next few days at your home, you will receive this engraved chair. Charles, if you want to cue the slide there, delivered to your home in honor of your many contributions. Can you see that?
Can see it. Thank you very much.
Great. So,
what a surprise. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I just, it doesn't come close to matching what you've done for all of us, but we hope it will serve to remind you of how important you've been and continue to be to your students, to your colleagues, and to the life of the mind So thank you very much.
Well, I want to thank Bob and Shaylyn very much for taking time to share your wisdom, but also I want to thank you, David Barker and director of the center, and Candy Nelson, David Lublin is our chair, and Vicki Wilkins, the dean of the School of Public Affairs, and also this SPA technical support staff that helped produce these dialogues. Thank you very much, everybody. And David, thank you very much for organizing this. You did a great job.
All right, everybody. Well, that culminates our event and this series. Thanks so much, and we'll find a way to do this again soon, I'm sure. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Congratulations, Jim.
Thank you.